Hello and welcome to another episode of Thinking It Through with Nate. My name is Nate, your host. In this episode, I have a guest with me. His name is Ammon Gruwell. Among other things that I'll introduce that he does in the main podcast section, he's the Vice President and Director of Advocacy for Utah Approves, which is my organization. So we talk about some things given the scope of what we do with my organization, talking about democracy, representation, how we can fix the system to better represent everybody and stuff like that. We also go into a couple of other things, so definitely check it out. Without any further ado, Ammon Gruwell. All right. Hello and welcome to another episode of Thinking It Through with Nate. I have a guest today. His name is Ammon Gruwell. Ammon is a legislative candidate for District 15 in Utah, running with the United Utah Party. He's also the founder of the Utah Center of Electoral Reform. He's also the Vice President and Director of Advocacy for Utah Approves and is the Davis County Chair for the United Utah Party. And on top of all of this, he also works full-time as an engineer, as a father, and a husband. How are you doing today, Ammon?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on, Nate. I really appreciate it. I'm
Yeah, of
excited.
course. Of course. Yeah, I'm happy to have you on. As I just said, you do a lot, and so I'm excited to kind of go over a bunch of topics with you. So just to dive straight into it, as some of the listeners may have caught, Ammon is the Vice President and Director of Advocacy of Utah Approves, which is the organization that I founded. So that organization is largely focused on bringing more representative elections to Utah. Obviously, we have ambitions to try to fix the country at large as well, but we're just kind of starting locally. So, Ammon, what was it that got you interested in this type of work and trying to improve representation in Utah?
A lot of different things. I think my political journey really started around 2016 timeframe. I got into, the Republican presidential primary. I was excited about a couple candidates, and then ultimately the Republican Party nominated Donald Trump, and that was really discouraging to me. I felt like the party was kind of leaving its roots, leaving what it really believed in, what I thought it believed in. And so I left the Republican Party and supported the independent candidate Evan McMullen. He was running. He went to college here in Utah. He's native from here in Utah, and so he did the best here in Utah in his presidential campaign. So I volunteered a lot for that campaign, and I made phone calls and marched, did some marches in the street in support of him. And one of his key messages was democracy and helping preserve the core institutions that uphold our democracy. And after the election, obviously he didn't win, but he founded an organization called Stand Up Republic. And that organization was focused solely on protecting the core institutions of our democracy, things like free speech and judicial independence and the rule of law, things like that were being eroded by Donald Trump's presidency and just a lot of the rhetoric that was going on in the national sphere. So I was very much involved with that. That led me to how do we improve our democracy? How do we preserve it? And I felt like really one of the core problems with our country was the two-party system. Um, I mean, we've had a two-party system for since the beginning of our country almost, but for many many years, those two parties were relatively close to each other. They agreed on a lot more than they disagreed. And interestingly, um, there were a lot of cross beliefs. Like the Republican Party in the North might agree on an issue with the Democratic Party in the South. That those type of dynamics. So there wasn't this sortition, I guess is what you could call it. This true sorting of people between the right and the left on every issue. But right around what I've learned recently is that right around the 1960s or so, with the civil rights movement, it spurred on this move towards true partitioning of the of electoral politics, so that um, basically everywhere you went within your sphere, everyone agreed with you, and you just didn't interact with people on the other side of the spectrum all that often. Whether wherever you went to church, where you went to work, your friend groups, they all kind of agreed with you on every issue, and you just never heard the other perspectives. You never heard the other side. The two sides have just become polar opposites, and that's a huge problem. And I see election reform as a way to solve that.
Yeah, that was really well put. So you mentioned a lot of really interesting things here. So I'm just going to try to touch on them in order. The first thing that you mentioned that was interesting to me was about Evan McMullen. And he's kind of a very interesting phenomenon because I might be wrong, but Utah was one of the only states, or maybe the only state, that is a Republican state that voted for somebody as much, or it might have been a little bit less than Donald Trump, but it was a significant amount. And I think you kind of alluded to part of the reason of this, and part of it is because the institutions are breaking down. And the reason that a lot of people feel that way, I think, about Donald Trump was because he kind of disregarded any kind of like processes and official ways of going about things in the political sphere. And that is one thing that a lot of people appreciated about him, but he also did it in ways that weren't very tasteful. And I think the reason why Utah was one of the only conservative states who didn't like Donald Trump was because of that reason. And so, can you maybe give some insight on why you think that? Usually that's a liberal reaction to Donald Trump, but why do you think that even a lot of conservatives had that reaction here in Utah?
Sure. There were a lot of people angry with Donald Trump within the Republican Party in Utah. A number of reasons. First of all, he was just crass and vulgar. That's really anathema to the culture here in the state of Utah. Um, he was also really antagonistic to minorities and people from other countries. A lot of Utahns have spent significant amounts of time abroad, and they love those cultures that they spent time with, and so they come home with that love of those cultures, and so they resent people that would just make blanket statements about blanket derogatory statements about other cultures. And so between those things, I think that pretty well sums up most of the distaste for Donald Trump here in Utah.
Yeah, that's really well put. You touched on something very interesting about how people in Utah, largely because the LDS Church sends people on missions across the world, they get experience with other cultures, and um, that tends to lead to a valuing of diversity. And I think although Utah is not very diverse, um, and it being a conservative state, which usually is a value that doesn't take place in conservative states, I think that has led to this overvaluing comparatively of diversity here in the state. But what's really interesting is you don't see the woke interpretation of diversity. You actually see people valuing community and valuing your neighbor and wanting to help out. So I think that's something that's really cool about here in Utah. And I think that is something that can lead to maybe Utah being somebody who makes significant progress on key things before a lot of other conservative states do. And one of those things is going to be hopefully representation and democracy. And so, on that note, you mentioned that the two-party system has kind of been around for a long time, but it isn't until somewhat lately that this sortition has been happening, that polarization has been getting a lot worse. What do you think has led to that sortition? Because a lot of times we talk about the problem with the current system as being the two-party system. But if that's been around for a long time and the sortition is just happening recently, it may be playing a role, but what were the other factors that kind of kicked in that caused that?
I mean, I've read a number of theories, but a couple books I read recently really pushed towards this idea that it was the civil rights movement that brought this about. For many decades before that civil rights movement, both parties disagreed on things, but there was kind of this unholy alliance, between white people in both parties, that as long as you know black people were the other, they could at least agree on that issue. And there's a lot of alliances kind of surrounding that issue. But once that broke down, once the Democratic Party went all in on civil rights, you saw a host of Southern Democrats leave to the Republican Party. And there was no longer this idea that one region of a party would, be different from another region of the party. There was, they became much more similar across the country. And there were other factors that played into that. The rise of cable news, where you could kind of choose the partisanship of your news. Previously, we just had three news channels, and everybody heard the same facts, heard the same opinions, got the same news. But now you could all of a sudden kind of choose if you wanted a left or right perspective on that news. And social media only amplified that even more, and we end up in our echo chambers. So there's a lot of different factors that you can't pin it on any one thing, but all those factors build on each other. And so now we have this really strong partitioning between the right and the left, and that's a problem for the health of our democracy.
Yeah, that's really well put. I think the overarching theme between what you just said was that politics largely became nationalized. It wasn't only that you could be in a certain area and think something that was different from a party in another area, but also, as you said, news became nationalized as well. And I think part of this is just natural human psychology. When things scale up like that, and you start to have that choice between what kind of news you're going to hear, you're obviously going to choose the type of rhetoric and language that is most pleasing to your ears, and that leads and usually that comes from just tribalism. It comes from that state of kind of, as you mentioned, you grow up in an area and you don't hear any other views. And so when you hear someone confirming those views, it sounds right to you. And I think this is a huge issue that we're battling with nationalization. One thought that I have that could help solve this is making things local again, making people tune into local journalism, not just like the nightly news that goes over all the crime and the traffic, but actual local journalism and emphasizing that and focusing on that more. Do you have any thoughts on that, or maybe other things that could help solve this nationalization and tribalistic issues?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I know there is no local journalism is struggling right now. I mean, we just had a newspaper here in Davis County, Utah, that was the Davis Clipper. It was a long time publication here local that just shut down because they just couldn't get the ad revenues they needed. I mean, they weren't able to pay their people, so they shut down. And that's been happening across the country. We still have a pretty strong statewide news culture here in Utah, but even they at times are struggling. The Salt Lake Tribune just stopped printing daily just because they were struggling in that area. So I don't really know how to help that. I think they need to come up with some kind of different business model. I know a lot of national newspapers and even the Tribune, they're going to a subscription model. We have to pay for some of their content, and I think that's helped. I think the Tribune has also gone to like a nonprofit where they're accepting just donations from people and soliciting donations from people, and I think that's been relatively successful as well. I don't have the answer to saving local journalism, but I think it's definitely something worth saving.
Yeah, it's a very hard issue. And I think part of the issue is just getting people to care about local issues again. When we have such easy access to worldwide news, that's a lot more inflammatory. And so it's easier to pay attention and form an opinion on. Um, so I think that there's like two groups of reforms that need to take place in the US to really fix these issues. One of them, as we've been talking about, is fixing the news atmosphere. But something that I think we have focused on more is the other issue, which is fixing representation in the government. And one thing that I know we agree on is that the end goal should be to reach proportional representation. And for listeners who don't know what this is, essentially proportional representation would attempt to elect the amount of representatives that equally represent the opinions in the population. So if 40% of people, preferred apples in the population, then 40% of representatives would try to make apples more popular, right? And so on and so forth. Um, so I guess my question is, if proportional representation is the end goal, um, why aren't we working on it right now? And tagging onto that, what do you think the path is to actually achieve proportional representation in the long term?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really tough problem because a lot of countries in the world use proportional representation, um, but we don't, and most people in the United States don't even know what it is or have even heard about it. There's been a lot of political science research into what leads countries to adopt proportional representation, and for a long time, the leading theory was you needed to adopt proportional representation to get to a multi-party system, a system with more than three parties. But more recent research around that issue has actually leaned towards the opposite, in that you have to have a multi-party system for the legislature to adopt proportional representation. And so it's somewhat of a chicken and egg issue here, where a multi-party system leads to proportional representation, and proportional representation, I'll just call it PR, leads to a multi-party system. But I mean, how do you get there? How do you get there first? Which do you get first? And so that's really what leads us to supporting approval voting right now here in the state, is because we believe that approval voting, adopting approval voting statewide will allow third parties to grow, primarily just because it'll show true support for third parties. Third party candidates won't be discouraged from running because they're, a spoiler candidate or a drawing vote away from the person they're most similar to. Um, it's because with approval voting, it's fine to have 3, 4, 5 people in the race because voters are independently, giving a thumbs up or thumbs down to each candidate rather than only being forced to choose only one. And so I think approval voting will get us to the point where maybe we could even have third parties that are relatively strong, that have a relatively strong voice, maybe even get elected to a race here and there. And once we get to that point, I think the chances of us adopting proportional representation will be much stronger because you'll have, maybe you'll be halfway to a multi-party system, which will get us at least halfway to proportional.
Yeah, very well put. So I think a lot of the issues that we're running into right now in this effort to try to nudge the system towards somewhere where it could adopt PR is that a lot of people are looking at the small gains, some of the gains that you just laid out that approval voting might achieve, and kind of framing those as if that's the end goal. And I think this is really easy to do, not even just with this topic, but with a lot of topics. It's really easy to see a problem and think one step down the road and think, well, that would solve this problem, and that's all there is to worry about. How do we get people to start focusing on the big picture more? How do we start getting people to think, well, what do we really want at the end so that we can actually lay out this overall strategy rather than having people think that passing something like ranked choice voting or nonpartisan primaries would just solve the issue outright?
Tough. Yeah, it's a tough question. I don't know how to get people. I mean, I think it starts with awareness. So few people are even aware of approval. So few people are aware of proportional representation. I think ranked choice voting is just now kind of getting into the mainstream. Most people you talk to have at least heard of it, at least here in Utah, since a lot of cities used it recently. Um, and as with any issue, the more well-known it becomes, the more polarized it becomes. I think RCV has become really polarized here in the state. The right wing, has latched on to the fact that Fair Vote, which is the main RCV ranked choice voting proponent, is, funded by a lot of left-leaning organizations. And they've already started incorporating ranked choice voting into a lot of, conspiracy theories and that type of thing. So it's become polarized. My hope is that we can introduce approval and proportional representation in a way that is a little bit less polarizing. I don't know if that's even possible. But yeah, I think it starts with awareness and with education. Once it's in the mainstream and we get mainstream candidates talking about it, I think it has a much better chance of getting traction.
Yeah, so you pose that very prescient problem right now about avoiding polarization as we try to spread awareness on these issues. And I think it's going to be really hard because, kind of as you alluded to, we almost need candidates talking about these policies for people in the political sphere to recognize that. But the second that a candidate starts talking about a policy, if they're aligned with a party, then you pretty much polarize the issue. Do you think there's other paths to maybe bringing awareness without going through the political path?
That's interesting. I think there's a role for organizations like ours who are, we're explicitly cross-partisan, nonpartisan. If we could do a lot of that education, it would potentially avoid that early first impression polarization that happens. If the first time you hear about an issue is from a candidate you hate, then you're just going to by default hate it. But hopefully, if you hear about it from a non-candidate first, then it can be internalized and then just seen as generally a good idea. So yeah, interesting idea.
Yeah, and I think this is something that is part of our work for the next few months, especially, and trying to understand how to do this. A lot of this is going to come day by day as we analyze just what the landscape is in Utah and trying to approach it that way. Um, awesome. So I want to just move on to another topic, kind of unrelated, but something that I'm very interested in and that we've touched on a little bit, just like off camera, but I'd love to dive in a little bit more. So you've mentioned that your views on belief and religion have changed in the past few years, especially. Could you maybe give a quick summary of what led to that change and then maybe how you view things now?
Sure. So I grew up in an LDS home, a very traditional home, very orthodox. We did all, we checked all the boxes. We did all the right things, and I mean, one thing that we emphasize in the LDS culture is, praying and studying, Holy Scriptures and going to church regularly. And I did all of those things. I went to Brigham Young University, which is a church-owned school, church-owned private school. I went on a church mission to Brazil for 2 years. Um, Came home and got married, and then entered the workforce. And right about that time, when I graduated and was starting to work, I was reading a lot of really good books. And some of those books that I was reading were talking about things like human psychology and human history, like ancient human history, um, and evolution, and a lot of these ideas. And more and more as I read these fascinating books, I grew to understand so much about humanity. And the more I understood, the more I realized that I just couldn't see a place for the supernatural within that materialistic framework. Learning about how the human brain works, with neurons firing and dopamine flooding the brain, and oxytocin when we're close to people we love. All those emotions are really just driven by hormones, and I struggled to find the place in that worldview for things that were supernatural. And this produced a lot of cognitive dissonance in my life, in my mind, just because religion had been everything. It had driven the course of my life up to that point. And me and my wife were very religious, and so it was something that I just kind of pushed down and tried hiding for quite a while. And but you get to the point where you feel like you're living inauthentically, when people don't know something that's deep seated within you. I mean, I really can't understand what it's like to be someone who's LGBTQ in a closet, and not being authentic in that way. Or there's various other ways that you could be living inauthentically because you're afraid of what people think. But in my experience, it really, like, hiding my own change in beliefs really tainted all of my relationships. In every relationship, no matter how close it was, in the back of my mind, I thought, would they still care about me? Would they still love me if they knew who I really was, if they knew what I really believed? And just it became, even though beliefs seem like such a small thing, in many contexts, it became a huge thing in all of my relationships. And I just felt like I was being a hypocrite and living inauthentically. And so finally, after a year or two, I talked to my wife about it. I talked to my close family, talked to my close friends about it. And a lot of them took it really hard. It was a really hard transition. But ultimately, I approached it with respect. I approached it with love for the people around me. And even though some of them took it really hard and it took them a little while, they saw that respect coming from me, and they ultimately all returned that respect to me. And I think my relationships with all those people are healthier than ever. And I think really the biggest key to any change in belief like that, my biggest problem when I was believing in the church was that I was very dualistic about it. I saw my beliefs as right and everyone others as wrong. Mine is good and others is evil. And I was a champion for those beliefs. And it's so easy when you transition to a different belief to have the same problem, say now I'm right and now everyone else is wrong, right? And to just go from one dualistic place to another, a soldier on one side to a soldier on the other. I mean, it's the same thing with politics. It's just, you're just fighting, and it doesn't matter what side you're on. And so I feel like I've grown, and I've strived to stop diving into the warfare of my belief versus yours, and just try to love each other, love people, love and respect other people, and find value in all beliefs. And so I'm not here in any way saying that beliefs are bad or evil, or that people should stop believing, but that was my journey, and I've learned to love and respect people of all beliefs.
Yeah. That's awesome. I have to say, it's really admirable that you approached your close relationships in that way after your shift in belief. So for me, I kind of shifted out of religion when I was about 16, 15, 16 years old. And so you can imagine the conversation between me and my parents was pretty heated. And
Yeah.
I definitely approached it in a I kind of sprung it on them and ripped the band-aid off. And if they were going to argue against me, I was going to argue back. So I really like that you did it that way. And I think that can go to show a lot of people either approach it the way I did, or even if they are later in life, they'll maybe just cut off ties with people who have those beliefs or just assume that they're going to cut you off if you tell them. So I think that's really instructive and a great way to look at it is to at least try to bridge that gap. And that just shows that below beliefs and all of this kind of comes with like compassion and humanity are at the root of us. And if we can get to that with everybody, we can kind of reach common ground. And even if we disagree on things, we can still get along. Um, so
Yeah,
that,
and I think that's at the heart of all religions too, that compassion, humanity, that love. I mean, that's really what, Christ, Jesus Christ taught, and that's what the Buddha taught, and at the heart of every religion is that core essence. And if you change beliefs, if you're transitioning out of religion, don't transition out of that, because that's what really matters.
Yeah, I love that. And kind of like you said, like a lot of people will go from a religion and then go like completely, evil atheist or whatever, And I was kind of that way. I was I consider myself very hardcore atheist, anti-theist and stuff like this. But you mentioned that it's kind of valuable to come back to that middle where, you find that humanity, that compassion, that love. And the way that I kind of view this is that there's like religion, which is very dogmatic and checking the boxes, kind of as you put it. And then you have like complete anti-theism and anti-religiosity, which becomes very materialistic and rigid and not willing to even engage in things that may be conceptual and out of a fear that they like that could be related to supernatural. But the way that I like to view it is that that middle ground is what I call spiritual. And I don't think spiritual has to do with anything supernatural. Spiritual very much is related to love and compassion, to just living your life moment to moment and accepting things as they are. To get into etymology a bit, spirit in Latin basically just means breath, and breath is life. And so that's kind of how I like to view it is that there's that middle ground of just living. You're just being, you are. Um, do you have, so you mentioned before we talked, you mentioned meditation. So along with meditation, are there any other things or practices or views that you have gained that kind of fit into this middle ground, or maybe you just want to speak on meditation?
I so I still attend church actually. I still attend my LDS congregation maybe 2 or 3 times a month. I've tried to attend some other churches. Me and my wife went to a liberal Quaker church about a month ago, and that was a really awesome experience. If you've never been, it's literally like a group meditation where periodically people will stand up and just talk about their life and things that they've learned. I thought that was a really positive experience. I'm striving to find goodness in all religions and in all people. As for my personal, spiritual practice, yeah, it's meditation. I think I really like to just quiet my mind and experience the present. So I do that as often as I can. I wouldn't say I have any other necessarily spiritual practice other than maybe reading good books on my own or with my wife. I wouldn't say I necessarily have any spiritual beliefs. So I guess you could call me agnostic or atheistic in that respect. But I believe in the goodness of humanity, and I believe in, I guess, the sacredness of life. And so those are kind of my guiding principles.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I think everyone can take something from that. And like you said, it's about the way I like to put it is to take the baby out of the bathwater with religion, right? You find the good in it. Um,
There you go.
yeah, awesome. Well, I know you said that you were kind of thinking you might have to go around this time. How are you feeling, or is this a good cutoff point?
Yeah, I think now's a good time to finish
Okay,
up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming. I think that was an awesome conversation, and I think my listeners are going to enjoy it. Do you want to give any shout outs to your work or social handles?
Yeah, so like you mentioned before, I'm running for the Utah legislature, House District 15, so you can find me pretty easily. I'm the only Ammon Gruwell out there on Twitter, on Facebook. Um, and yeah, and the United Utah Party is a great place for political moderates if you're looking for a political home.
Okay, awesome. All right. Well, that was Ammon Gruwell. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will catch you in the next one.
Thanks so much, Nate.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching this episode of Thinking It Through with Nate. As always, you can help me fight the algorithms by subscribing on Supercast, link down in the description. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and follow, hit that like button and bell icon. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.